The fall of the new order in Indonesia put an end to 32 years of Suharto's presidency and brought about sweeping changes throughout the world's fourth most populous nation. Baharudin Yusuf Habibie was sworn in as the new president of the republic in May 1998, and he quickly proceeded to undertake political reforms at both national and provincial levels. In an unprecedented move, Habibie also agreed to address the decade-long issue of East Timor and started a negotiation with Portugal, the former colonial power which ruled the eastern half of Timor for almost 3 centuries, and also the United Nations. The first Europeans who arrived on the island of Timor were Portuguese, and they gradually extended their sphere of influence until 1702 the island became officially known as Portuguese Timor, a colony under Portuguese control. Meanwhile, the Dutch East Indies, which controlled much of Lesser Sunda Islands, the archipelago Timor was a part of, started to encroach the western part of Timor. The island was then partitioned between the two European powers under the Treaty of Lisbon, in which Portugal received the eastern half of Timor, along with the coastal exclave of Oecussi. In 1974, Portugal saw a revolution which led to the overthrow of the old regime and the withdrawal of Portuguese forces from its overseas colonies, including Portuguese Timor. Political parties were legalized in East Timor, but the people of Timor were divided in their visions. Three major political groups emerged. The Timorese Democratic Union, or UDT, sought for a continued association with Portugal. The Revolutionary Front for an Independent Timor-Leste, or Fretilin, was a Marxist group that fought for independence, and the Timor's Popular Democratic Association, or APODETI, supported integration with Indonesia. On November 28, 1975, Fretilin went ahead and unilaterally declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste from Portugal. In response, UDT, Apodeti, and some smaller political parties, with the help of Indonesian intelligence, signed the Balibo Declaration, calling for an integration with Indonesia. 9 days after the independence declaration by Fretilin, Indonesian forces began its invasion to East Timor under the codename Operasi Seroja. For a period of 24 years, Timor-Leste was occupied by Indonesian military and controlled by the central government in Jakarta. The Indonesian government claimed this former Portuguese colony as its 27th province, despite the fact that United Nations never recognized Indonesian control over the territory. The tripartite agreement called for a referendum in East Timor in August 1998, whereby Timorese would be able to choose between special autonomy within the Unitary Republic of Indonesia or independence. The referendum eventually gave a clear majority in favor of independence, and following this, East Timor went through a process of transition managed by the United Nations. The region ultimately restored its independence on May 20, 2002 as the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste. The occupations also transformed the entire East Timorese society. Under the Portuguese rule, institution was weak and the European power perceived this colony as remote and economically marginal. Therefore, it decided to allow minimal political, social, economic, and cultural intrusion in the eastern half of Timor Island. A total of 32 ethno-linguistic groups in Portuguese Timor were able to develop their distinct cultural identities. When Timor-Leste first gained its independence from Portugal, East Timor nationalism was still quite thin on the ground. Most of the East Timorese were not able to see themselves as a part of a group other than their respective ethnic groups. 24 years later, however, East Timor, which was known as Timor-Timor under the occupation, saw an extraordinary level of nationalism reflected in the rise of popular resistance movement and ultimately the results of 1999 referendum. The unprecedented spread and rapid development of Timor's national consciousness in less than 3 decades was an exceptional case, and this had been possible largely because of the rather unsuccessful efforts made by Indonesia in incorporating East Timor into its national project. Benedict Anderson refers to such phenomenon as the ironical logic of colonialism. Anderson's other theory, which suggests the close relationship between the development of print capitalism and the spread of nationalism, is unable to explicate the strong sense of nationalism in Timor, considering the underdevelopment of capitalism and low literacy rate in the region. The ironical logic of Indonesian colonialism provides the best explanation of this phenomenon. Indonesian occupation has shaped the Timorese national identity, and during this time, an identity uniting all Timorese regardless of ethno-linguistic backgrounds was born. A map was a model for, rather than a model of, what it purported to represent. Similar to how Irian Jaya was imagined into being when the territory became incorporated into the map of the Republic of Indonesia, borders were drawn around the region known as Timor-Timor by the central government of Indonesia. Despite sharing the island of Timor with Indonesians, East Timor under Portuguese rule never bothered to imagine their territory as a unit different from the western half of the island. When East Timorese began to imagine their local reality, they referred to the maps which illustrate East Timor as a unified jurisdiction. Maps, however, failed to capture the diverse ethno-linguistic groups inhabiting East Timor. In effect, map imagination erased fragmentation within East Timor society and served as a foundation to build a unified Timorese identity. Indonesian regime also made an effort to museumize this imagined community of East Timor. And not surprisingly, this proliferation of museums in Indonesia was a profoundly political project. Timor-Timor Museum, which was supposed to encapsulate all Timor's traditions, failed to represent this complexity. Instead, it created an imagined quasi-logo form of the unified Timorese identity. The traditional house of Fataluku people, Umalautem, became known as the traditional house of East Timor. Thais, which originated in Dili, became known as the traditional clothing of East Timorese people. And despite the fact that Likuraya dance was often performed by the West Timorese youth, during the Indonesian occupation this dance was recognized as the traditional dance of East Timor. These symbols were instantly recognizable and they could penetrate easily to popular imagination, forming a really powerful emblem for a unified East Timor. Under Portuguese rule, East Timor experienced very low degree of institutionalization. Most development took place in Dili, the capital of Portuguese Timor, and the vast interior of Timor was largely untouched. Indonesia, however, performed a significantly different approach, which involved government penetration into local villages. Until 1975, education was only accessible for the assimilados, urban and Portuguese-oriented Timorese who were considered as elite. School was conducted in Portuguese, and when the Portuguese left East Timor, 93% of the population was illiterate and only a small percentage had access to secondary education. As the Indonesians settled into the occupation of East Timor, they began to establish an Indonesian school system. The Wajib Belajar program required all Timorese of age 6 to 13 to attend primary school. The language of instruction was Indonesian, and the school system quite successfully produced a generation of young Timorese who speak fluent Indonesian language. However, history shows us that education failed to make Timorese view themselves as full-fledged Indonesian citizens. Indonesian government banned the use of Portuguese language, but recognized some 30 indigenous Timorese languages as regional languages. East Timor's most widely spoken indigenous language is Tetum, an Austronesian language which is also spoken in the Indonesian province of East Nusa Tenggara. While Indonesian was largely used for sophisticated political and social interactions, Tetum was commonly spoken in daily life. While Indonesian was largely understood by the Indonesian educated young generation, Tetum served as the language of all generations. The Indonesian government also embraced the fact that Tetum was so widely spoken by the majority of Timorese. The Department of Education and Culture of Indonesia then published textbooks in Tetum for elementary, junior high, and high school students. Indonesia under Suharto's presidency was known for its aggressive anti-communist policy. Using the national ideology of Pancasila as a tool of propaganda, the central government in Jakarta required all Indonesians to follow one of five recognized religions: Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism, Hinduism, or Buddhism. At the beginning of Indonesian occupations, only about one-third of Timor's population was Catholic. The vast majority of people still practice traditional polytheistic beliefs. The introduction of Indonesian law led to mass conversion of Timorese to Catholicism, and Timor Timur became one of two predominantly Catholic provinces of Indonesia, the other one being East Nusa Tenggara. By the end of the occupation, approximately 96% of Timors identified as Catholics. When Portuguese army and colonial administrators left the region, church became the only colonial organizational institutions remain in East Timor. Throughout the occupation period, Catholic Church became known as a place of refuge for Timor's identity. Anderson argues that a popular Catholicism emerged as an expression of common suffering, just as it did in 19th century Ireland. The Indonesian government gave freedom for all religious institutions to choose their working language. Some ethnic churches, known as Gereja Kesukuan, used local languages in their services. The Catholic hierarchy of East Timor decided to adopt Tetum, not Indonesian, as the liturgical language. For the first time, Tetum was not merely seen as the lingua franca, but the language of East Timor religion and identity. In addition, the Catholic Church of East Timor also chose to remain under the direct administration of the Vatican instead of joining the Bishops' Conference of Indonesia, known as KWI. This separation resulted in Timor's Catholics perceiving themselves as different from Indonesian Catholics. The Catholic Church also played a role in producing new leaders of resistance movement. The Catholic Church gained more trust from the local population when Monsignor Martinho da Costa Lopes became the new apostolic administrator in the provincial capital of Dili, and he started to voice his criticism against Indonesian government and Indonesian military. Carlos Felipe Jimenez Bello was appointed as the Bishop of Dili in 1983. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1996 for his works toward a just and peaceful solution to the conflict in East Timor. In addition, the first two presidents of East Timor were both educated at mission schools in Dili. East Timor provides an intriguing story of the failure of Indonesian assimilation campaigns. East Timor's nationalism was born amid the intrusive modern development started by the Indonesian regime. Indonesia hoped to convince East Timorese that they belong to the same family. After all, their languages are similar and their original cultures are identical. However, Indonesians failed to treat East Timorese as their brothers and sisters. Timorese national consciousness was manifested into aggressive political and military actions after the infamous Santa Cruz massacre, the shooting of more than 150 pro-independence protesters in the Santa Cruz cemetery on November 12, 1991. In response to the violent tragedy, activists around the world began to show support for East Timor independence from Indonesia, which was realized in 2002. The relation between Indonesians and Timorese became somewhat similar to that of Indonesians and the Dutch, the colonized and the colonizer. The assimilation policy introduced by Suharto mirrored that additional politic introduced by the colonial government of the Dutch East Indies, and it was proven to be an example of the ironic logic of colonialism.